possible in part by the Detroit News, Michigan's largest newspaper striving for integrity and journalistic excellence for 115 years.
Doors open. 6 degrees right on course. On the way.
This rusting scrap in Alaska is what remains of an anti-aircraft gun that was nothing less than the center of the universe for its Japanese crew from June of 1942 to July of 1943. Here on Kiska and on the island of Attu, 200 miles to the west, Japanese forces grabbed a toehold in North America. Never since the War of 1812 had an invading nation held territory on the American home front. That confrontation brought thousands of Americans, Canadians, and Japanese north to fight in a place which didn't even exist in the minds of their countrymen. Many died here. All who came were marked forever. So too were the people of Alaska, who lived on in the shadow of this war that came to them. Their towns and lives were changed dramatically. But through this human tempest, one thing remained the same. This place, Alaska. Here, land and sea offered harsh and equal treatment to the forces that arrived to do battle. World War II came to Alaska in the early days of the clash between Japan and America, and the territory offered an inhospitable welcome. General Masatake Okamiya, now an author and historian in Tokyo, sailed for Alaska with the Japanese fleet.
We left Ominato, Japan for Alaska in the spring of 1942 and immediately encountered the typical weather of the North Pacific, sailing all the time in fog so thick we couldn't even see the vessels right next to us. The waves were very high, and even aircraft carriers had trouble navigating.
Weather in the Aleutians. In the wintertime, a succession of great storms. In the summertime, drifting fog. But the great thing in flying there is survival. One should go completely prepared, thoroughly trained on instruments. We had information that the Japanese would probably hit us on the summer of 1942 in the Aleutians.
In the 1930s, as today, Japan was a densely populated island nation heavily dependent on other countries for food, petroleum, and industrial minerals. For almost 50 years, its national policy had stressed peaceful trade as the keystone of international relations. But as the grip of the Great Depression tightened in the early 1930s, Japan was losing vital foreign resources and markets. Militarism grew in popularity as a solution to the economic ills, and anti-democratic elements saw this as an opportunity to dominate the government. By 1931, Japan was at war in China. The civil government back home was in shambles and didn't have the popular strength to stop their generals who promoted military solutions to the economic crisis.
Young people at that time, including me, just believed what we heard from other people. What I heard was that the United States was going to stop the supply of petroleum. We were told that 70% of Japan's petroleum came from the United States. Of course, if that happened, Japan would eventually collapse. We understood that there were negotiations underway with the United States, but nothing seemed to come of them. We believed war was inevitable.
By 1939, the sad possibility of war also began to color life in remote and vulnerable Alaska. President Roosevelt sent a new territorial governor to Juneau that year, Ernest Greening. When Greening arrived in pre-war Alaska, he found a raw land with fresh memories of the gold rush. Most of the territory's population of about 70,000 lived in southeast Alaska, where fishing and hard rock mining were the mainstays. Except for a railroad from Tidewater to Fairbanks, transportation off the coastal shipping lines was by small bush planes and dog teams. Roads were virtually non-existent. Alaska's native peoples, the Eskimos, Indians, and Aleuts, far outnumbered Caucasian settlers. Schools and health facilities were inadequate even in the larger towns. In the villages of bush Alaska, tuberculosis raged. The salmon and mining industries were run from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, and they called most of the shots for Alaska like feudal lords. President Roosevelt knew Greening as a man of proven intellect, integrity, and pioneer optimism. He was what the neglected territory needed, especially with the war approaching. Greening was an unlikely champion for a military buildup, a medical doctor and a distinguished journalist who had campaigned against U.S. gunboat diplomacy in Latin America. But in 1939, with growing uncertainty in Japan, and Alaska with only about 500 military personnel, Greening and other Alaskans pushed for more arms. Greening found an ally in General Simon Bolivar Buckner, the new commander of the U.S. Army in Alaska. Buckner was single-minded in his drive to fortify Alaska. He improvised where he had to, and because time was precious, occasionally dispensed with some red tape. The buildup was in full swing in 1940 and 41, and the Army Corps of Engineers and civilian workers set a frantic pace. Captain Benjamin B. Talley arrived to oversee all military construction in Alaska. He and Buckner cut peacetime construction schedules in half. They built Elmendorf Airfield near Anchorage in 1 year instead of 2. Thousands of engineers, soldiers, and workers streamed north, and the simple fact of their migration brought astonishing changes to the primitive territory.
Well, 1940, when they determined to build a base at Elmendorf, there was a terrific influx of people, both outsiders and Alaskans. People slept in shifts. They couldn't get housing or a place to stay. The hotels were always crowded. So even residents rented out rooms in their homes in shifts. 8 hours for one fellow, 8 hours for another, and 8 hours for someone else. Some of the fortunes we have in Anchorage today were predicated on the fact that people had cash during the war years and afterwards and invested it in land, and then, of course, later reaped enormous profits.
Well, when we learned that the Army had selected Anchorage for headquarters, we were delighted not only for the economic boost that was coming, but first of all, the defense. There would be some defense of Alaska instead of leaving us totally exposed with no defense. We knew we were going to have all sorts of things happen. You can't defend the wilderness. You have to have roads, you have to have communications, you have to have all the things that we had sat here wishing that Alaska had, so you'd open it up and people could use it.
Fear of war also brought momentous change to Alaska's coastal villages. American engineers built artillery emplacements and major Navy bases at Sitka, Dutch Harbor, and here on the beautiful island called Kodiak. Hank Eaton remembers the coming of the American forces.
Well, Kodiak was just a kind of a sleepy little fishing village prior to the war. Fishing was the primary source of income for most of the men here. And then in the off seasons, they dug their gardens and chopped their wood and took care of the cows and this sort of thing. Made them self-sufficient, more or less. We weren't used to that high-pressure type of living. You had to get up at a certain time. The men that went to the base for jobs had to learn to use the clock, which they didn't before. You know, times went by seasons before, not by hours. So, yeah, the pace picked up. Everything changed.
And for young Zenji Abe in Japan, the pace of change was fierce too. He went from teenager to bomber pilot in fairly short order.
We were totally ignorant about the Americans at the beginning. I don't know how our authorities made their calculations about the strength of the Americans, but the comparative strength, I know now, was about 70-1 against Japan. But there I was, the youngest pilot at Pearl Harbor. It was my first combat, and I was very frightened. Electricity ran down my spine.
The Japanese strategists who sent Zenji Abe and his fellows against the Americans knew they could not win a long war against the industrial might and vast natural resources of the United States. So Japan's entire military approach was designed around quick, decisive strikes. Japan wanted control of Asia and the Western Pacific without interference from the Americans. Their plan to neutralize the Americans was to wipe out the U.S. Pacific Fleet beginning at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese viewed America as decadent, isolationist, and not willing to go to war. The Americans viewed Japan as a belligerent, treacherous nation. After Pearl Harbor, a similar attack on Alaska seemed likely to many. Planes poured into Elmendorf Field, which was ready thanks to the stepped-up construction schedule. In Anchorage, false alarms sounded often.
The alerts were quite frequent at first. For example, most of them were prompted, in fact, I think almost all of them were prompted by drifting logs in the inlet, considered to be possible submarines, or by whales in the springtime, when the whales would come up and people would report them as submarines again. People that should have known better were victims of hysteria probably more than ordinary citizens. For example, the military determined through General DeWitt that the Japanese had to be interned. Then they held hearing, and I was supposed to present the case for the government in the hearings, and all you had to do was prove that the guy was an enemy alien, and that was it. There was no way that he could avoid being interred and locked up. It was a shocking thing. Later on, it was regretted, but the damage had been done. It was an absurd thing, and it shows that war brings out the worst in people often. The military, General DeWitt again, wanted to put Alaska under martial law, but thank goodness we had General Buckner up here in charge, and he liked Alaska. He talked DeWitt out of it. It was one of the best things that ever happened, because there was absolutely no need for martial law at any time during the war, and history has proved that.
The fear of a Japanese attack on Alaska spread to the distant Arctic coastal frontier too. There, the people of the ancient Eskimo bands would have had no means at all to resist a Japanese landing. Many Eskimos didn't even realize they were American citizens at the time. Greening and Buckner realized, though, that the Eskimos were perfectly suited to patrol the desolate coast and sound early warning. So Buckner sent Major Marvin Marston to the Bering Sea coast to enlist and train Eskimos as members of the Alaska Territorial Guard. Traveling by dog sled in the dead of the winter after Pearl Harbor, Marston told the Eskimos their country needed them. If they needed to know what country, he told them, and nearly 100% of the eligible men enrolled. Marston and Greening used the recruiting trips to encourage the Eskimos to exercise their rights of citizenship, to petition their government, to vote and run for office. In short, to become citizens of the democracy. When the Japanese attack on Alaska came, it was not to the Eskimos' gentler beaches on the mainland, but to shores like this one in the Aleution Islands. There are few sites suitable for harbors out here, so both invasion and defense were immensely complicated. But it was here the Americans continued their drive to fortify. In March 1941, the Corps of Engineers built an airfield on Umnak. To keep it secret, they planned an elaborate deception.
We were right in the midst of the season when the air was just bursting with sounds for the fishermen getting ready to open the canneries and everything. So what was more logical than to pick a fictitious name, the Blair Packing Company, I believe it was, and that is the thing that we referred to in all of our radio messages and in all of our correspondence, and we did it so effectively that the Japanese, when they made their attack, didn't even know of its existence.
The terrain on Umnak was a combination of soggy, grass-covered volcanic ash and sand, and it couldn't be paved.
But you could not depend upon landing. In fact, you couldn't have landed on it under snow conditions and under rainy weather and that sort of thing. We had to have a field that was good 24 hours a day, the year round.
So for the first time under field conditions, the Americans used an interlocking system of perforated steel sheeting called Marsden matting. Talley's Navy counterparts bet him a case of French champagne the Corps of Engineers couldn't build the Umnak airfield in 2 months, but they worked around the clock, and after the site was graded and treated, they laid 80,000 pieces of Marsden matting to finish before the 60-day deadline. On April 1st, 1942, American planes could land at Umnak.
That night I sent a radio to Commodore Parker, who was in charge of the naval operations at Kodiak, and I said, make mine Moe.
The attack for which the Americans were preparing was set by their enemy for June 3rd, 1942. The Japanese raid on Dutch Harbor was part of a larger plan to finish off the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Midway.
We sent 4 of our large aircraft carriers to Midway, and 2 small carriers were sent to the Aleutians as part of the same plan. We hoped that a diversionary attack on the Aleutians would draw part of the American fleet in that direction. Then our main force would destroy their fleet and take Midway. In the Aleutians, we planned to attack Dutch Harbor, then occupy Attu and Kiska. We wanted air bases in the Aleutians and on Midway, so we could intercept any American airplanes trying to attack Japan.
The main Japanese force stood ready near Midway, under the command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, one of the great geniuses of naval warfare. His plan was sound, his fleet superior in numbers. But Yamamoto did not know that the Americans had broken one of his radio codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz would keep America's main strength at Midway, and Yamamoto's feint in the Aleutians would be wasted. Nonetheless, the Japanese Northern Fleet sailed on to attack Alaska. Concealed within a typically nasty Aleutian weather front, the Japanese light carriers Ryujo and Junyo sailed to a point 180 miles from Dutch Harbor and prepared to launch their planes. The Americans in the Aleutians had received advance warning, and they were out looking for the Japanese force. Navy patrol planes flew long missions over the stormy seas. Air Force bomber crews led by Colonel William Erickson were standing by to attack the Japanese if the patrol planes could find them.
When we found where the fleet was, he took off, disappeared in the fog, and only one of his whole squadron made contact with the enemy. They all got lost in the fog, and when coming back, they landed at Umnak.
On the first day, we were given orders to attack Dutch Harbor, and I took off with 2 squadrons of dive bombers. The problem was that dive bombers aren't effective at all unless they can start their dive from 12 to 15,000 feet, and the clouds and fog made that impossible. We were unsuccessful, therefore, and returned to the carrier. There, we learned that bombers from the other carrier, bombers that can attack in level flight, had been successful. On the second day, when our commander gave us our orders to attack, he purposely mentioned that the bombers from the other carrier had gotten through, and therefore we dive bombers must attack. I could understand his desire, but he was quite wrong to urge us on, because dive bombing is quite different from bombing in level flight, and I knew our attack would be a waste.
On the first day of the Japanese attack, radio communications to the secret air base at Umnak broke down. When the Japanese attacked the second day, though, the American fighters from Umnak got the word. They caught up with the Japanese returning to their carriers.
I
was at first happy because I thought I had run into our own fighters coming out to meet us. Then I saw they were American fighters. 2 of my veteran pilots lost their lives during the dogfights, and we lost others in the sea because their fuel tanks were shot up. They crashed, shouting banzai to the Emperor over their radios. Returning to our carriers, there was no time for celebration of our attack on the Americans, because as the squadron leader, I had to write letters of sympathy to the families of my lost comrades.
The Americans on the ground also lost comrades at Dutch Harbor, 25 of them. But though Japanese bombs set fires blazing, only some gas tanks, several buildings, and an old transport ship were damaged.
At 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a lot of gunfire and bombs exploding and one heck of a lot of noise. There was a fire over at Fort Mears. There were 3 columns of smoke going up in the air. And I got my prisoners in I was making a bomb shelter and I got them in the hole. And a Zero flew over the beach about 150 feet out over the water. I shot at him once when he was in the clear.
The outcome at Dutch Harbor was inconclusive. Only the weather and terrain could claim clear victory. But at Midway, where the main battle had taken place, Japan suffered a terrible defeat. Yamamoto lost 4 of Japan's 6 carriers, along with 332 planes and a third of Japan's pilots. Midway was the turning point in the Pacific War, and Japan would never recover. And because the Japanese lost so badly at Midway, the troops who landed in the Aleutians a few days after the attack on Dutch Harbor were told to dig in. The propaganda value of holding American soil in the Aleutians became immense. The news released by Imperial headquarters was that the diversion at Midway had been successful and assured the great Aleution victory. The original Japanese plan called for the troops to stay until fall, but now they would spend the winter. The Japanese also feared the Americans might attack the home islands from the Aleutians if left unopposed there. Word of the Dutch Harbor attack spread through Alaska. Now the Japanese really were here, and how far they would move inland was a matter of grave speculation. As it turned out, the Japanese had no plans to occupy more territory. But on Kodiak and in other coastal towns, the military prepared civilians for invasion.
So they told us that we could have our choice of either surrendering if they made a landing, or we could take to the hills and fight a guerrilla warfare. And the decision was entirely up to us. We were given a gas mask, a rifle, a helmet, and about 60, 70 rounds of ammunition. And with that, we could make our choice. And that was civilians and the Army.
Still reeling from Dutch Harbor, the Americans found a Zero damaged by a Navy patrol plane. It was an amazing gift from the usually troublesome soft tundra. They salvaged it to train their own pilots to fly against Zeros. American pilots throughout the Pacific would have better odds against Japan's superb fighter. Some have suggested that the Americans should have simply ignored the Japanese on Kiska and Attu and let them try to survive hundreds of miles from home under some of the most hostile conditions in the world. But on June 11, 1942, the day after the Japanese were discovered on Kiska, the instinctive reaction of the Americans was to strike back. For the first air attack ever against an enemy on American soil, the 11th Air Force had only 6 newly arrived bombers with very green crews ready to fly. They went to Kiska anyway, taking along a seasoned Navy patrol plane navigator to show them the way. From their base at Cold Bay, the young men flew the 1,200-mile round trip to bomb the new enemy, perhaps to die. The Japanese had used their first few days on Kiska wisely, building anti-aircraft emplacements, and part of the northern fleet that had delivered the troops was still in Kiska Harbor. So the flak over Kiska was thick when the American raids began.
I want every man to stick by his gun, use every round of ammunition on this ship.
And the deadly routine began. While the Air Force scurried to get more bombers ready to attack Kiska, a heroic wing of Navy patrol planes kept the pressure on the invaders at great cost. The Navy planes were big, slow, and not very maneuverable, but they had machine guns and bomb racks. Flying from bays nearer Kiska and supplied by seaplane tenders, they attacked using modified dive bombing techniques that pushed the planes to their limits. Many of the planes and crew of Patrol Wing 4 were lost in the terrible first days of the Kiska Blitz. When the heavy bombers of the 11th Air Force were ready to strike with strength, the Americans frantically but methodically rained tons of bombs on the Japanese. Erickson and his crews flew mission after mission, often with little or no sleep.
Eric, with his dog Scooch and his wonderful squadron and his morale, and he was a fantastic fellow. Eric was a fighter primarily, and he didn't give a damn about much else. His idea was closing with the enemy and getting at him.
As a plebe at West Point, Erickson had written the Army fight song, and in the Aleutions he wrote insulting jingles which he broadcast on his radio to taunt the Japanese during bombing runs. The Japanese soon recognized his voice and returned his taunts with cries of "Eric, we'll get you." Day by dangerous day, this would be their war. And on Kiska and Attu, between bombing raids, the Japanese settled into something resembling routine life. They worked on their fortifications around the clock, building an extensive network of tunnels and bomb shelters. They built dugout huts with camouflaged sod roofs, reminiscent of traditional Aleut dwellings. The Japanese Navy quickly resupplied the garrisons and prepared them well for a winter in the Aleutians. The Aleuts on Attu were put to work by the invaders, most of them as fishermen to feed the occupation force.
I remember well the little children on Attu. They looked so much like us. The only difference was the language, but gestures were quite sufficient to understand. They tried to teach us how to live there. They showed me how to catch sea urchins to eat, how to open the shell and get at the inside.
The Japanese finally took the Attuans to Hokkaido, Japan. There they were put to work, guarded loosely by civilian police and paid for their labor. They were not treated at all like military prisoners. Still, 24 of the 42 Attuans died in Japan, most of dormant tuberculosis they carried with them from Attu and activated by the stress of strange surroundings and diet. As a safety precaution, the Aleuts from other islands were soon evacuated by the Americans. For several months, the Americans had been aware of the threat a Japanese invasion posed to the Aleuts, but no one took the responsibility to relocate them until the frantic days after the Dutch harbor attack. So with only a few hours' notice, they became the first American war refugees since the Civil War. They were taken to abandoned canneries in southeast Alaska, 2,000 miles from their Aleution home. In the rush, the most basic needs of the Aleuts were overlooked, and many died in the cold, wet camps.
In all that 200 people, we got 3 outside toilets off the dock and 2 faucets running water outside And every winter come with the water frozen, no water, so we got to go out of the bay. It was about a mile wide. We use a skiff, go over there and pack water all day long sometime for all that 200 people there.
My boy got sick. And I went to nurse. She gave me some oranges to give him, that's all. That was all. No medical, no medicine, or nothing. He was so happy to go to school that winter. And he didn't make it just because of the death. And there was other people died there too. And those who have TB, they sent it down to Tacoma, Washington. So they didn't come back.
Everywhere in the territory, the war was a watershed that would forever differentiate old Alaska from new Alaska. Hard rock gold mining, for instance, along the mainstay of Juneau, shut down during the war and never regained prominence. The wartime government closed the mines because gold was not a strategic mineral and the manpower and supplies were needed elsewhere. Some of that manpower and energy went into performing nothing less than a logistical miracle in Alaska, the fruits of which would later transform the primitive territory forever. The number of road, port, airfield, and other projects underway at once remains astonishing, even by modern standards. By the end of 1943, the Army Corps of Engineers would be spending $1 million a day in Alaska. Building and maintaining supply lines to Alaska was first in the minds of the American defenders. And fearing the Japanese submarines might attack northbound ships, the Americans' Canadian allies flew anti-submarine patrols over the Gulf of Alaska. But though the Japanese submarine offensive never materialized, Greening, Buckner, and others pushed hard for a long-awaited highway connection to mainland America. The Americans and Canadians began building the Alcan Highway in March 1942. In just 8 months, 10,000 men cut 1,645 miles of pioneer road. The Alcan cost $138 million and was built through the northern wilderness under conditions that included truly frightening infestations of mosquitoes in summer and minus 60-degree temperatures in winter. The harbors, roads, and airfields weren't used just for bringing people and supplies into Alaska. New routes through the territory were a backdoor for supplying ships and planes to the Soviet Union for the Allied war in Europe. Here at Cold Bay, at the eastern tip of the Aleutians, ships and supplies were delivered to the Soviets as part of the Lend-Lease program to keep them supplied to fight Germany. And the Soviets also needed planes for the brutal air war with Hitler's Luftwaffe. So 8 airfields along the Alcan Highway were links in the Alaska-Siberia route for ferrying nearly 8,000 airplanes to Russia. The route ran from Great Falls, Montana, through Edmonton, Alberta, Whitehorse, Yukon Territory, and Fairbanks, and on to Siberia. The alternative, a route through the Middle East, was far longer and nowhere near as safe from German detection or attack. With green pilots often at the controls on the pioneer route to Fairbanks, it's a wonder only 133 planes were lost. For almost 2 years, Russian crews lived at the transfer point at Fairbanks to take over from American pilots for the final leg to Nome and across the Bering Sea. The Russian pilots had only a few days in Fairbanks to master the basics of these new American airplanes. There would not be time to learn the finer points until after their trip across the Bering Sea and Siberia. For Russian pilots who were skillful and lucky enough to have survived their Eastern Front, Fairbanks was the closest they would ever come to rest and recuperation. once the paint dried on the new Red Stars, it was back again to the bloody battle on the Eastern Front.
The night before the pilots were to take a fleet of planes out, or whatever they were called, after they had the Russian controls and the Red Star in the wing, a number of the stores would stay open at night, and they would buy all of the delicacies that they could find to take home. The stores would save all of the silk stockings for them. We went bare-legged. They would save all of the fancy furs, shoes. In the grocery stores, we even had a supply of caviar. The liquor stores, the very finest.
Fairbanks found new life in the wartime activity and the steady stream of people and goods that poured in over the busier-than-ever Alaska Railroad.
Changes were very obvious in town. Additional people came in, and then the military coming in, of course. But generally, people were very anxious to improve their living conditions here, and people immediately kind of got over the feeling that they were going to make a stake and then leave. There was a definite permanence that could be felt in the city.
The Americans continued to chip away at their unwelcome guests in the Japanese Aleution fortresses. But the 1,200-mile round trip from Umnak to bomb Attu and Kiska was taking its toll, a number of planes lost to foul weather and overtaxed crews. The Americans needed airfields closer to their targets. Adak, an exceptionally rugged island, was only 2 hours flying time from Kiska, but reconnaissance indicated that the terrain was so bad it would take several months to build a runway there.
The airfield conditions there, the prospective sites, were very, very poor. But we had to have it. We found a lagoon which would be drained at every tide as the tide went out and be refilled, of course. We built a tidal gate across the front of it, automatic, so that when the water went out it would flow, and then when the tide came in it would not refill. And we had an airfield there which was operative in 2 weeks.
The Americans were master builders. While they succeeded with ingenuity, skill, and a mighty transportation force, the Japanese staggered under the demands of far-flung operations and inadequate equipment.
In November, it was decided that an airstrip be built on the northern side of Kiska Bay. We were engaged in the airport construction, which was very simple, because all we had were picks, shovels, and pushcarts.
While the engineers built runways and supply centers out the Aleutians, the American and Canadian navies worked at seizing control of the sea around the islands. The Japanese garrisons on Kiska and Attu were dependent on ships for their most meager existence, and interrupting the flow of supplies was a major priority for their enemy. American submarines, old World War I S-boats, patrolled Aleutian waters from a base at Dutch Harbor. The Navy's newer subs were in battle on other fronts, so in the remote Aleutians the sailors made do. S-boat interiors were cramped, cold, and dripping wet from condensation, and it must have been a terrible life trying to keep pressure on Japanese shipping from beneath that black, stormy ocean. The Americans achieved final dominance at sea in the Aleutians in a decisive battle 400 miles west of Attu off Russia's Komandorsky Islands. American Admiral Charles McMorris, his 2 cruisers, and a handful of destroyers intercepted a Japanese convoy off the Komandorskys on March 26, 1943. The Japanese Admiral Hosagaya was escorting the convoy with ships from his northern fleet, and his force outnumbered the Americans by 2 to 1. They fought for 3.5 hours in what proved to be the last major naval battle fought without aircraft carriers. The outnumbered Americans disabled Hosagaya's gunnery control aboard his flagship Nachi. McMorris's biggest cruiser, the Salt Lake City, was hit badly and went dead in the water. He hit her behind a smoke screen, and then, unbelievably, Hosagaya disengaged and began steaming back toward Japan. Hosagaya was low on ammunition and also feared an attack by U.S. land-based bombers from Adak, which by then had its airfield. His fear was unfounded, though. because on that day in freezing weather, the Americans' bombs at Adak were frozen solid to the ground.
And that was really the last attempt, serious attempt they made to run with strength a convoy through to the two islands.
In February 1943, the Americans decided to bypass Kiska and attack Attu, 200 miles further west. Then Kiska would be completely cut off and much more easily taken. Against Attu and its 2,600 Japanese troops, America's Admiral Thomas Kinkaid sent 11,000 soldiers on 5 crowded troop transports, accompanied by 3 battleships, a light carrier, 6 cruisers, 19 destroyers, and many supporting ships. In May 1943, about 11 months after the Japanese occupied Kiska and Attu, they met their American enemy face to face in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. The main American assaults would come at Holt's Bay on the north side of Attu and Massacre Bay on the east. The plan was to drive the Japanese into Chichagof Valley in the middle and destroy them there. D-Day, May 11th. The American assault troops circled in landing craft, waiting for a thick fog to lift and reveal the beach. After 7 hours of floating in limbo, it was time to land or go back to the transports. Finally, a picket boat equipped with short-range radar and a recording fathometer led the landing craft through the rocks and shoals to the beach. The small armada ghosted along at a crawl on the gray surface until the picket boat skipper announced with his megaphone that the beach was 300 yards dead ahead. No one had seen the beach, but the landing was on. The American strategists in California estimated their force would need only 3 days to take Attu. Buckner and his staff in Alaska thought otherwise, but their advice went unheeded. The Americans encountered no resistance on the beach, a defensive pattern that would become familiar in the Pacific. Moving inland, they met small arms fire coming out of the mists. They dug in for the night, which was falling like a curtain on the eerie scene. They dug in, a foot or two that is, until entrenching tools hit frozen ground, so they lay in shallow holes in a cold drizzle. The Japanese troops were hopelessly outnumbered, but well dug in on the high ground. Often hidden in cloud-obscured positions, they could still see and fire upon the Americans below. More familiar with the miserable conditions on Attu, the Japanese took as allies the rugged terrain and freezing, foggy weather, but even they couldn't change the ultimate outcome. For the assault on Attu, General DeWitt asked for the 35th Division, commanded by a general who knew the Aleutians. Instead, he got the 7th Division, which had been training in the California desert for combat in North Africa.
No, we couldn't keep dry. They give us leather boots, and they give us a little heavier jacket, a little heavier pants, and your feet would swell up after being wet. You kept your foot off. If you have your shoes off for more than 10 minutes, you couldn't put them back on because your feet were hurting.
The Americans lost more men to swollen feet, frostbite, and the terrain than to the Japanese. The Japanese had calculated the ranges to all the key passes the Americans would have to move through.
When we climbed up the hills, they seemed they were one step ahead of us all the time. Every time you took an inch, you draw fire. As you advanced up, they'd draw like heavier fire. So it's just like it was going against a wall, you know. So you would move on by inch. It didn't advance too fast. You just feel your way like in the dark.
Despite improper clothing, an amphibious assault that bogged down, and the determined Japanese defenders, The Americans were just too strong. After 9 days of fighting, the Japanese were clearly losing. The Japanese on Attu reported their grim situation to their headquarters at home. On May 20th, Colonel Yamazaki, the commander of Japanese forces on Attu, sent this message. The enemy Air Force bombed and strafed while the naval guns shelled our troops, which sustained heavy casualties. None of the officers and soldiers were at any time discouraged or demoralized. On the contrary, they are firmly determined to die on Attu in battle in order to defeat the enemy. The battle continued. After 2 weeks of combat, though, the Americans took the high ground on the rugged slopes and surrounded the Japanese. Colonel Yamazaki had fewer than 1,000 men, including his wounded. Forced to withdraw into Chichikov Valley, the Japanese had only one hope, and a slim one at that. A daring charge through here, the Americans' weakest point on the valley floor. Yamazaki hoped speed and momentum would surprise the Americans and allow him to break through. From there, Yamazaki could race that way through Clevisy Pass. Then he'd storm down to the beach where the Americans had stores of ammunition and food. The plan was desperate at best. On May 29th, the stoic Colonel Yamazaki sent the following message to headquarters in Japan. Most of our positions on the front line have been captured by the enemy, and today we barely are able to hold the remaining positions. The withdrawn force will attack the enemy and will display the true glory of the Imperial Army in carrying out the final attack. Yamazaki then ordered his code books and wireless sets destroyed, so he never received a reply. We received reports of your resolute determination and fine morale and were filled with deep gratitude. We wish you calm sleep as the pillar of the Northern defense. In the early hours of morning, under cover of darkness and fog, the Japanese made their charge. They scattered the first group of Americans they encountered. It looked as if they might make it, until they came to a hill overlooking the pass to the beach, on top of which was the American engineer encampment, commanded by Major James Bush. They repeatedly charged the Americans' commanding position on high ground and were beaten back time and again by the heroic engineers until reinforcements arrived. Colonel Yamasaki was killed, sword in hand, during a final charge. With no hope of victory or escape, the scattered remnants of the Japanese force took their own lives. All but 29 of the 2,600 Japanese on the island died. Of the 11,000 Americans who fought there, 549 died, and 1,148 were wounded. Kiska was alone now, the Americans near victory in the Aleutians. The 5,400 Japanese on Kiska had listened to the radio reports of the annihilation of the Attu garrison by obviously superior forces. Their time was near. They prepared for death. Toru Kobayashi was a chief quartermaster on Kiska.
At that time, most of the Japanese thought it was a sacred mission to sacrifice your life for the country. But being newly married, it was a great dilemma for me, since my first son was born in January 1943. I was very glad about it, but I was worried also because I had not seen him and our situation on Kiska was becoming worse. About this time, we heard of the mass suicide on Attu. My diary shows a little song I wrote. All through the day, I am thinking of how to die. But then, isn't it pitiful to be thinking of the easiest way out? All hopes are gone, since the gods have abandoned Kiska.
By the middle of June, the Japanese had laid plans for an evacuation by ship, but they needed luck to elude the dense American sea patrols. Then, on July 26th, part of the American fleet blockading Kiska gave chase after radar signals they believed could be a Japanese evacuation convoy. Because of darkness and dense fog, the Americans never made visual contact, though they fired dozens of salvos and burned up tons of fuel firing at the radar targets. No wreckage was found, and there is no Japanese record of their ships in the area. Most experts attribute the false signals to atmospheric conditions and limitations of radar in 1942. The American ships had to steam out of their patrol area to replenish their fuel and ammunition. While they were gone, the Japanese evacuation fleet, which had been hidden in rain and fog 400 miles away, steamed through to Kiska.
We were just about desperate when, at about 8 in the morning on July 29th, we were told that ships were approaching the bay. We had gone to the beach many times before then and not been saved. But this time, in the very thick fog, we saw ships approaching. They looked like phantoms. I looked around myself and saw that everybody's faces were flushed from joy and excitement. We all spontaneously shouted, "Banzai!"
The survivors of the last garrison on Kiska still embrace the spirits of their comrades who died supplying the island and defending Attu.
I believe it was the intervention of these 3,000 souls, as well as the souls of those who died on Attu. They saw to it that we escaped the island. We are very thankful.
After the Japanese fled Kiska, the war continued relentlessly in the Aleutians. The Americans bombed the island for nearly 3 weeks after the evacuation, unable to verify that the island was uninhabited. The apparent lack of activity on Kiska might be another Japanese ploy. Word of the tenacious defense of Attu had spread through Alaska, and the invading force was taking no chances. Nearly 3 weeks after the Japanese left, 33,000 American and Canadian troops made a tense amphibious assault. Canadians were the first to land. The landings were unopposed, of course. But as though unwilling to let the soldiers off easy, the weather and terrain again conspired wickedly. In the fog and confusion on Kiska, 21 men were killed and 121 wounded by accidents and shots fired by their own comrades. During the mop-up and occupation of Kiska, the Americans found scraps of food from the last meals of their enemies, abandoned clothing, unfinished games of Go. They also came across the grave of an American pilot shot down during the bombing. The Japanese had inscribed the marker in English. Sleeping here, a brave air hero who lost youth and happiness for his motherland. July 25th, Nippon Army. Though some of the Alaskan commanders, Buckner most notably, urged an invasion of Japan via the Aleutians, by late 1943, the Americans had decided against the plan because of the now well-known Aleution conditions. Instead, the Americans used the islands for bombing raids against the Kurile Islands on the northern perimeter of Japan. In the Kuriles, the Japanese had the airfields and fighter strength they could never muster at Attu and Kiska. So the Air Force and Navy bomber crews paid dearly on their raids. But they kept Japan harassed on the northern frontier and kept more Japanese soldiers and supplies out of the main war in the Central Pacific, where Japan's war-making machine was losing ground. For the rest of the war in the Aleutians, the old enemy, the weather, still fought fiercely, and the tedium of the remote outpost without the urgency of battle was unbearable. The men in the Aleutians became part of a forgotten war. No one heard of their sacrifices or their personal victories of courage or simple survival. Few heard about the Aleuts who returned after the war to find their homes in ruins, or the Aleuts who never saw their homes again. And few knew about Alaska's other native peoples for whom the war so greatly accelerated the change from one way of life to another, an ambivalent journey even today. Few heard that General Simon Bolivar Buckner never returned to live in Alaska as he intended. He was killed in the closing hours of battle at Okinawa. Few heard that Colonel William Erickson never made general in spite of his heroic fight. He was just too outspoken for his superiors. He died in 1966. Few know that survivors and relatives of the Japanese invasion of Alaska return to the Aleutians every few years to honor the fallen from both sides. Some people heard of Ernest Greening. After statehood in 1959, Alaskans made him a U.S. Senator. In the Senate, he fought for human rights and against the Vietnam War. He died in 1976. And today, most people have heard of Anchorage and the oil boom that fired its recent growth. But not many realize that the sad and desperate years of war built so many of Alaska's roads, harbors, and airports, pulled Alaska from obscurity to national attention, and changed every town and every person. And Alaska, the land, the sea, after all the turmoil, this Alaska remains unchanged.
War Chronicles is a series that covers the battle events of World War II. Join noted actor and veteran Patrick O'Neill Friday nights at 9:30 for The War Chronicles here on 56.
Mountbatten, the man destined to lead British India through the turbulent transition to independence.
I came here with the firm determination that India would not be split into two separate